It is March 16th, 1244. The air on the Pog of Montségur is thin and impossibly cold. High in the Pyrenees mountains of southern France, a fortress perches on a sheer cliff, more like an eagle's nest than a human habitation. For 10 long months this castle, Montségur, the safe mountain, has been under siege. Inside, a starving, exhausted community of soldiers, civilians, and spiritual leaders has held out against the combined power of the King of France and the Catholic Church. But now, it is over. A 2-week truce has ended. The terms of surrender are absolute. Just after dawn, a procession begins. Not of defeated soldiers being dragged in chains, but of men and women walking. They descend the treacherous mountain path, not in despair, but with a strange, otherworldly calm. They are not forced. They are not pleading for their lives. They are singing. At the foot of the mountain, a massive pyre has been built, a field of dry wood and straw, larger than a house. The papal inquisitors and the French seneschal watch as over 220 people walk directly towards it. These are the parfaits, the perfects of the Cathar faith, the spiritual elite. They have been given a final choice: renounce their belief, kiss a cross, and accept the authority of the Church, or burn. Not one of them recants. They move into the wooden enclosure, the field of the burned, as it will come to be known. They go 2 by 2, men and women, holding hands. They are not pushed. They climb onto the pyre of their own free will. The inquisitors, perhaps shocked by the display, do not even bother to tie them to stakes. And then, the fire is lit. The flames engulf the structure, a single, horrifying column of smoke rising into the clear mountain sky. By midday, there is nothing left but ash. This event, the mass immolation at Montségur, is not a story of execution. It is a story of mass suicide, a story of martyrdom on a scale that baffled even the medieval mind. It is also not the beginning of a story. It is the end. It is the terrible, final punctuation mark on a 40-year war of terror, a crusade launched not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against Christians in the heart of Europe. A war designed for one purpose, not just to defeat a people, but to annihilate a belief, to erase it from human memory. They were called the Cathars, the pure ones, and their existence, their faith, and the secret they protected represented the single greatest threat the medieval Catholic Church had ever faced. A threat so profound, so dangerous, that the only possible answer was extermination. Historians like René Weiss, who has written one of the definitive accounts of Montségur, describe the scene as something beyond comprehension for the attackers. The soldiers were prepared for a fight, or a surrender. They were not prepared for this calm, willing acceptance of a horrific death. It forces us to ask a question that echoes across 8 centuries. What did they believe? What secret could be worth more than life? What truth could make a wall of fire preferable to compromise? Was this merely a theological dispute about the nature of good and evil, as the Church claimed? Was this a fight over the heresy of rejecting the sacraments, the tithes, and the power of the Pope? Or was something else being silenced that day? The official history, written by the victors, tells of a righteous war against a dark, dualistic cult that preached suicide and denied the divinity of Christ. But the whispers, the legends, the forbidden traditions of the Languedoc region tell a different story. They speak of the Cathars not as heretics, but as guardians, the guardians of a purer, more ancient form of Christianity, a Christianity that held women as equals, a Christianity that believed the God of the Old Testament was a false god, a Rex Mundi, or king of the world, who had trapped divine souls in a prison of flesh. And most dangerous of all, the legends speak of a treasure. A secret carried from Jerusalem to the mountains of France. A secret that the church had to bury in ash. The legends claim the Cathars were the protectors of the true Holy Grail. Not a cup, but a bloodline. The physical, living descendants of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, the guardians of the daughter of Jesus. This is the story of that fire. The story of the truth it was meant to consume. And the story of how, against all odds, the secret survived. To understand what happened at that pyre, we must first understand the world that built it. We must go back, before the crusade, before the fire, to the land that came to be known as the land of heresy, a place of poets, of tolerance, and of a faith that would sign its own death warrant. We must go to the Languedoc. Before the fire, there was a garden. The world that gave birth to the Cathars was not a dark, ignorant backwater. It was, in fact, one of the most brilliant, vibrant, and tolerant civilizations in all of medieval Europe. This was the land of Languedoc, stretching across the south of modern-day France. From the Pyrenees to the Rhône Valley, Languedoc in the 12th century was a world apart. Politically, it was not truly France. It was a patchwork of powerful, independent domains, ruled by sophisticated nobles like the Counts of Toulouse and the Trencavel Viscounts of Carcassonne. They spoke their own language, Occitan, the language of the first European troubadours. This was the culture of parage, a concept that has no simple translation, but encompasses nobility, honor, and courtly love. While the rest of Europe was largely a feudal landscape of illiterate warlords, the courts of Languedoc were centers of poetry, music, and philosophical debate. Historian Zoe Oldenburg described it as a land that valued civilization above all else. It was a place where different ideas were not just tolerated, they were actively explored. Jewish scholars, Moorish philosophers, and Christian thinkers coexisted in cities like Toulouse and Montpellier, creating an intellectual ferment that was unthinkable in Paris or Rome. And into this garden of tolerance, the Cathar faith arrived. We do not know exactly where it came from. Its roots are Gnostic, stretching back to the earliest days of Christianity, perhaps from the Bogomils in Bulgaria or the Paulicians in Armenia. But when this seed of an older faith landed in the fertile soil of Languedoc, it exploded. It spread not through conquest, but through conversation. The Cathars had no army, no cathedrals, and no central authority. They had only their good men and good women, the bons hommes and bonnes femmes. These were the parfaits, the perfects we saw walking into the fire at Montségur. To understand Cathar society, one must understand its two tiers. First, there were the credentes, or believers. These were the vast majority. They were the shopkeepers, the farmers, the knights, and even the noble ladies. They lived in the world, married, had children, and ran their businesses. They were not required to follow the faith's harshest rules, but they respected and supported those who did. And then, there were the perfects. A perfect was a man or woman who had received the consolamentum, the only sacrament that mattered. This consolation was a spiritual baptism, a transmission of the Holy Spirit that they believed descended in an unbroken line from the apostles themselves. Once consoled, a perfect's life changed completely. They became an ascetic, renouncing all worldly possessions. They were celibate. They were strict vegetarians, eating no meat, eggs, or cheese, anything born of carnal coupling. They did not swear oaths. They would not kill, not even an animal. They traveled in pairs, dressed in simple black or dark blue robes, carrying nothing. They moved from town to town, house to house, working as weavers or artisans and preaching in simple terms that everyone could understand. And the people of Languedoc loved them for it. Why? because the local Catholic clergy was often exactly the opposite. They were famously corrupt, wealthy, and often absent. They demanded tithes and lived in luxury, while the bons homes lived in poverty and offered genuine spiritual comfort, healing the sick and speaking with humility. To the average person, the Cathar perfect looked like a true apostle, while the Catholic priest looked like a greedy landowner. Even the nobility protected them. A lady of a castle, like the famous Esclarmonde de Foix, might receive the consolamentum and become a perfect herself, presiding over a community of believers. Local knights found the Cathars to be honest, peaceful subjects who caused no trouble. As the historian Mark Gregory Pegg notes, Catharism was not an alien faith. It was the local faith. It was woven into the fabric of the society, from the count's court to the peasant's hut. It was a decentralized, personal, and tolerant belief system in a land that valued exactly those things. This was not just a heresy. This was a parallel Christian church. And in Rome, Pope Innocent III, a man of iron will and absolute political genius, saw this for what it was. This was not a localized infection to be cured. This was a rival, a living, breathing alternative to Roman authority that was growing more popular, more respected, and more successful every day. The Garden of Languedoc, with its poets, its tolerance, and its good men, was not just a curiosity. It was a profound spiritual and political threat. It proved that a Christian society could exist without the Pope, without his bishops, his tithes, and his sacraments. And for that, it had to be destroyed. The garden had to be burned. But first, the church had to define why this beautiful flower was in fact a deadly poison. They had to define the doctrine that would justify a war. To understand the fire of Montségur, one must first understand the idea that lit it. The Cathar doctrine was not a minor disagreement. It wasn't a debate over the language of the Mass or the authority of a bishop. It was a fundamental, radical rejection of the entire framework of Roman Catholic reality. At the core of Cathar belief was dualism. The Church in Rome preached one God, the creator of all things, heaven and earth. The Cathars taught that there were two gods. First, there was the good God, the God of love. This God was pure spirit, light, and goodness. He was the God of the New Testament, the true Father of Jesus Christ. His realm was invisible, eternal, and perfect. And then there was the bad God, a lesser, malevolent creator. They called him Rex Mundi, the king of this world. This, the Cathars claimed, was the God of the Old Testament, the God of wrath, jealousy, and judgment. It was this God who had created the entire physical world, the sun, the moon, the mountains, our bodies as a trap. A prison designed to ensnare the divine sparks of light, the souls that had fallen from the good God's kingdom. Your body was not a temple, it was a tomb. This single idea, as historian Stephen Runciman outlines in his classic work, The Medieval Manichae, makes Catharism a Gnostic faith. Gnosis means knowledge. The Cathars believed that salvation came not from faith in the church, but from knowing your true divine origin and finding the path to escape the material prison. And the Roman Church? The entire institution? It was the ultimate creation of the bad God. Think of the implications. The Cathars looked at the Catholic Church, with its gold cathedrals, its jewel-encrusted relics, its land-owning bishops, and its power-brokering pope, and they did not see the path to salvation. They saw the perfect expression of the material world they despised. They saw the fortress of Rex Mundi. They rejected everything. They rejected the sacraments because they were physical acts. Water baptism? Worthless. The real baptism was the consolamentum, the baptism of spirit. The Eucharist? an absurdity. How could the divine Spirit of Christ be trapped in a piece of bread? They rejected the cross. To them, the cross was not a symbol of salvation. It was a symbol of torture and death. It was the instrument of the bad God. They rejected the idea of marriage, as it only served to create more bodies, more prisons, for more souls. Though this was a belief largely held by the perfects, the common believers lived more practical lives. They rejected the entire church hierarchy. The Pope, they said, had no authority. They called him the Antichrist, a servant of the material world. And, most critically, they rejected the church's primary tools of control, guilt, and fear. The Cathars did not believe in hell as a place of eternal torment created by God. Why would a God of love create a place of eternal suffering? Instead, they believed in reincarnation. If a soul died without receiving the consolamentum, without achieving gnosis, it would simply be reborn into another body, trapped again in the cycle, forced to learn again. This belief system was more than heresy. It was a complete, alternative reality. And this is where the theological threat became a political and financial one. If the church is a false construct, you do not pay its tithes. If the Pope has no authority, who you do not obey his edicts. If the sacraments are meaningless, you do not need its priests. If there is no hell, the church's power to grant absolution, to sell indulgences, to hold the keys to heaven, becomes utterly irrelevant. The Cathar faith was not just an idea. It was an economic and political revolution, wrapped in a theology. It dismantled the church's entire operating system. And it was working. In the Languedoc, people were abandoning the Catholic churches in droves. Tithes went unpaid. Land was being willed not to the church, but to the bonshommes. The local priests were figures of ridicule. For Pope Innocent III, this was the ultimate danger. It was a cancer that, if left unchecked, would not just corrupt Languedoc, it would spread and destroy the very foundations of Christendom. He tried preaching. He sent his best legates, including Saint Dominic himself. But the Cathar perfects, with their humble robes and profound knowledge of Scripture, often outdebated them in public. When preaching failed, the Pope turned to politics. He pressured the local lords, like Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, to arrest the heretics and confiscate their lands. But the lords refused. The Cathars were their neighbors, their families, their most peaceful subjects. Rome was losing. The most powerful institution on earth was being defeated by a handful of starving, black-robed ascetics. When persuasion, theology, and politics all failed, only one tool remained: total, unrestrained violence. But to justify a war, the Pope needed more than a theological disagreement. He needed a crime. He needed a martyr. And in 1208, he would get one. But even as the storm clouds of war gathered, the Church was largely unaware of the deepest, most explosive secret the Cathar perfects held. A secret that went beyond theology. A secret that rewrote the very story of Christ himself. A secret centered not on Jesus, but on the woman who stood beside him. The Church's political and financial panic was real. The Cathar doctrine of two gods and reincarnation was enough to justify a war. But this public doctrine, as radical as it was, paled in comparison to the true Cathar secret. This was the gnosis, the hidden knowledge, reserved only for the perfects and passed down in whispers. This secret rewrote the very origins of Christianity, and it centered on the most maligned, misunderstood, and dangerous woman in the entire Christian story, Mary Magdalene. To the Roman Church, the narrative was fixed. Mary Magdalene was the peccatrix, the repentant sinner, the prostitute, who washed Christ's feet with her tears. This image, powerfully solidified by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, was a cornerstone of the Church's teaching on repentance. She was a symbol of a fallen woman, saved by the Church's male authority. The Cathars said this was a lie, a deliberate and self-serving character assassination. The Cathars, as heirs to the Gnostic traditions, had a completely different set of texts, not just the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, but others, the Apocrypha, the hidden books. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and, most explosive of all, the Gospel of Mary. And in these texts, Mary Magdalene is not a prostitute. She is the chief disciple, the apostle to the apostles. According to these forbidden Gospels, she was the one disciple, male or female, who truly understood Christ's deepest, most esoteric teachings. While Peter and the others understood the message in literal, worldly terms, Mary understood the Gnostic truth, that the kingdom of God is not a place, but a state of inner consciousness. That salvation is found by finding the divine spark within your own soul. The Gospel of Philip describes her not just as a follower, but as Christ's koinonos, his companion or partner, a term with deeply intimate and even marital implications. The Gospel of Mary depicts her as the leader who must rally the other disciples after the crucifixion. It shows a direct confrontation, a jealous rivalry between her and the Apostle Peter. Peter, representing the new institutional church, cannot accept her authority. He complains to the other disciples, "Did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" To the Cathars, the answer was a resounding yes. In their view, Jesus had entrusted his true inner circle teachings to Mary Magdalene. She was the repository of the gnosis. Peter was the founder of the outer church, the public, literal faith. Mary was the founder of the inner church, the secret, spiritual truth. Historians of Gnosticism, like Elaine Pagels and Karen King, have shown that this suppression of Mary Magdalene was central to the establishment of the early church's power structure. Why? The reason is simple and devastating. If Mary Magdalene was the chief apostle, then the church's entire claim to authority, based on the rock of Peter and an unbroken male line of succession, simply evaporates. Furthermore, if women could be the chosen spiritual leaders, then the Cathar practice of having female prefix the bonus femmes was not a heresy, but a return to the true, original Christian practice. The church in Rome had built its foundation on Peter, the man. The Cathars had built theirs on Mary, the woman who held the knowledge. This was the great secret of the Cathar perfects. This was the forbidden gospel they taught in secret. The church, therefore, was not just fighting a public heresy about 2 gods. It was fighting to suppress a secret Gnostic tradition that empowered women and rendered the entire priesthood of Rome illegitimate. But this idea, as powerful as it was still just an idea, a dangerous, world-breaking concept. The Cathars, however, were rumored to possess something more, something that turned this spiritual belief into a physical, tangible, and generational threat. The legends of Languedoc claimed the Cathars were not just protecting a forbidden gospel, they were protecting a forbidden lineage. The secret they guarded was not just a text, it was a child. This is the most dangerous and speculative layer of the Cathar mystery. It is a story that exists in the shadows of history, in local French legends, apocryphal traditions, and the explosive research of modern authors like Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln in their book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail. This theory posits that the Cathars were protecting not just a spiritual truth, but a physical one. The legend begins in the chaotic days after the crucifixion. Mary Magdalene, now the designated leader of the inner circle and, according to this theory, the wife of Jesus, is in mortal danger. She is hunted not only by the Romans but by the temple authorities. And she is not alone. She is pregnant with, or has already given birth to, the child of Jesus. She flees. Along with a small entourage, perhaps Joseph of Arimathea, perhaps Lazarus, she escapes Judea by boat. The sea carries her to a safe harbor, a place far from the reach of Rome, a place that is already a known refuge for Gnostic and Jewish mystics, the coast of Gaul. She lands at what is now Saintes-Maries de la Mer, in the south of France. Local legend, deeply embedded in the culture of the region, tells of this arrival, but the most potent part of the legend is that Mary brought with her a child, a young girl. Some traditions name this child Sarah. Sarah, in this narrative, is the daughter of Jesus Christ, the direct, living heir of the royal blood of the house of David. Mary Magdalene and her daughter vanish into the Jewish communities of the region, which would later become the heart of the Languedoc. The child grows, marries into a local noble family, and the bloodline continues, in secret, passed down through generations. This, the theory states, is the true Holy Grail. The word Grail itself is reinterpreted, not sangreal, but sangreal, the royal blood. The Grail was never a cup. It was a womb. It was the bloodline of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. This secret lineage, this sang real, was preserved, nurtured, and guarded for centuries by a secret society, an underground stream of initiates who knew the truth. The Cathars, according to this theory, were the designated guardians of this lineage in the 12th century. This is why they revered Mary Magdalene above all others. She was not just the apostle of the Gnosis, she was the matriarch, the source of the divine lineage. This is why they elevated women to a status unheard of in Christendom, because the very vessel of their greatest secret was female. This, then, becomes the true reason for the crusade. The Gnostic doctrine of two gods was the public justification, the perfect excuse. But the real reason, the secret objective, was to destroy the guardians of the bloodline. The Church, founded on the spiritual authority of Peter, could not and would not tolerate a rival claim based on the physical, hereditary authority of Christ's own child. It was a war to exterminate a family line, a war to kill the descendants of Jesus. This theory, of course, is dismissed by mainstream academic historians as a modern fantasy, a conspiracy theory woven from disparate legends. There is no definitive contemporary text that states, "We, the Cathars, are guarding the daughter of Jesus." But those who study the mystery point to the circumstantial evidence. Why the obsessive focus on this specific region? Why the unprecedented violence of the crusade? A fury far greater than any other campaign against heresy. Why the Church's centuries-long systematic campaign to degrade Mary Magdalene from apostle to prostitute? And why, at the siege of Montségur, did the Cathars seem to be protecting something more than just their own lives? This explosive, terrifying possibility that Christ had a daughter and the Cathars knew it was the secret that simmered beneath the surface of the Languedoc. It was a secret that made the bonshommes not just heretics, but traitors to the entire world order Rome had built. And it was a secret that Pope Innocent III, whether he believed it or not, could not afford to leave unpurged. The risk was too great. The Garden of Languedoc had to be burned, and its guardians with it. All he needed was a spark to light the fire. For years, Pope Innocent III had tried everything. He had sent preachers, who were debated into silence. He had issued warnings, which were politely ignored by the powerful counts of Toulouse. He had excommunicated lords, who simply carried on as if nothing had happened. The Cathar heresy continued to spread, a parallel church growing stronger every day, protected by the very culture of the Languedoc. By 1208, the Pope's patience was gone. He needed a casus belli, a just cause for war. He found it in the figure of his own papal legate, Pierre de Castelnau. De Castelnau was a zealous, arrogant, and widely despised man. His mission was to force the lords of the Languedoc to submit to Rome's will and persecute the heretics. His primary target was the most powerful and tolerant lord of all, Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. In January 1208, after a furious and threatening confrontation, de Castelnau publicly excommunicated Count Raymond. The following morning, as the legate prepared to cross the Rhone River, a stranger stepped from the shadows. It was, according to the Church's report, a low-level knight believed to be in Raymond's employ. An argument broke out, and the knight drew his lance, running Pierre de Castelnau through. The legate was dead. For Pope Innocent, this was the moment, the exact moment he had been waiting for. It didn't matter who actually killed de Castelnau, or why. The Church immediately declared it an assassination, a heinous crime orchestrated by the heretic-loving Count of Toulouse. Pierre de Castelnau was declared a martyr. The Pope now had his justification. This was no longer a theological dispute. It was an act of war against God's own representative. Innocent III unleashed the full, terrifying power of the medieval Church. He issued a papal bull, a call to crusade. But this crusade was different. It was the first ever to be declared not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against Christians on Christian soil. And he offered an irresistible reward. He promised the nobles of northern France a plenary indulgence, the complete and total forgiveness of all their sins. All they had to do was fight for 40 days. But he also gave them something more tangible, the legal right to seize the lands, castles, and wealth of the heretic lords of the south. It was, as one historian called it, an invitation to holy robbery. In the summer of 1209, a massive army gathered at Lyon. Knights, adventurers, mercenaries, and fanatics from across northern France, Germany, and the Low Countries, all marching under the banner of the cross. This was the Albigensian Crusade. It was not an army of liberation. It was an army of occupation. The lords of the Languedoc, fractured and unprepared, were terrified. Even Count Raymond of Toulouse, seeing the storm, capitulated completely. He offered himself to the Church, was publicly flogged as a penitent, and, in a humiliating final act, joined the crusade against his own people. The army marched south. Their first major target was the powerful Trencavel lands, including the fortified city of Béziers. Béziers was a rich, populous city. It was home to both Catholics and Cathars, living side by side. When the Crusader army arrived and demanded that the Cathars be surrendered, the city's leaders refused. It was a matter of honor. They would not turn over their own citizens. They prepared for a siege. But the siege never happened. In a moment of overconfidence, a group of the city's defenders launched a small, ill-advised attack out of the gates. The Crusaders' brutal front line of mercenaries, the routiers, seized the opening, fought their way back through the gates, and stormed the city. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Crusaders flooded the streets, killing everyone in their path. The bells of the Church of Mary Magdalene rang in alarm as the citizens, both Catholic and Cathar, fled there for sanctuary. The soldiers, drunk on blood, smashed through the doors. They found thousands of men, women, and children huddled inside. They killed them all. They slaughtered the priests at the altar. They butchered the women. They dashed the children's heads against the stones. The city's Catholic leaders were horrified. The papal legate in charge of the crusade, a Cistercian abbot named Arnaud Amaury, was reportedly asked by a soldier how they were supposed to distinguish the heretics from the faithful Catholics. Amaury's alleged reply has echoed through history as the perfect summary of religious fanaticism. Cadite eos, novit enim dominis qui sunt eus. Kill them all, for the Lord knows which are his own. By the end of the day, the city of Béziers was a smoking ruin. As many as 20,000 people were dead. The crusade had announced its intentions. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no distinction. This was not a war. It was a final solution. The shock wave of Béziers paralyzed the Languedoc. One by one, castles and towns surrendered in terror. The great city of Carcassonne fell soon after. The garden of the troubadours was being systematically uprooted, burned, and plowed with salt. The church had declared total war. But the Cathars, the true believers, would not break. They retreated from the cities to their remote mountain strongholds, places like Montségur. The war raged for decades. The massacre at Béziers in 1209 was only the beginning. For 35 years, the Albigensian Crusade ebbed and flowed across the Languedoc. It became a complex, grinding war of attrition. The lords of the north, led by the infamous Simon de Montfort, carved out new kingdoms. The lords of the south, including the beleaguered Count of Toulouse, fought back, sometimes reclaiming their lands, only to lose them again. Castles were taken, cities were sacked, and the land was soaked in blood. The Cathar perfects were hunted relentlessly. When captured, they were burned, always burned. By the 1242, the independent civilization of the Languedoc was broken. Its spirit of tolerance was extinguished. Its lords replaced by the rigid authority of the French crown. The Cathar faith, once the darling of noble courts, had been driven underground. The bonds' homes were now fugitives, hiding in forests and caves, holding their secret meetings in barns by moonlight. And they had one last refuge, one final bastion: Montségur. Perched at over 1,200 meters, the fortress was a sliver of rock jutting into the sky. It was not a conventional castle. It was an eyrie, a sanctuary, a place of symbolic power. It was known to the Cathars as the head of their church, their synagogue of Satan, as the church called it. For years, it had been a safe haven, but in the spring of 1243, the time ran out. A French royal army, led by the Seneschal Hugues des Arcis, arrived at the foot of the mountain. They were joined by the full power of the Inquisition, led by the Bishop of Albi. The order was simple: take the mountain and erase the heresy forever. Inside the fortress walls were around 100 fighting men, and a much larger population of civilians, refugees, and, most importantly, over 200 Cathar perfects, including their leader, Bishop Bertrand Marty. The siege began in May 1243, and for the Crusaders it was a nightmare. Montségur was a natural fortress. The cliffs were sheer. The only real path up was guarded by a fortified outer wall, the Barbican. For months, the Crusader army, numbering in the thousands, could do nothing. They were camped in the freezing cold, far below, while the defenders rained insults and arrows down on them. Catapults were built, but their stones fell uselessly short of the summit. The siege dragged on through the summer, the autumn, and into the dead of winter. The defenders were starving, but their resolve was absolute. They were not just defending a castle. They were defending their faith, their gnosis, and, perhaps, the secret they held within. The Crusaders were failing. The mountain was unbeatable. Until it wasn't. In the dead of night, in the deep snows of winter, a team of Basque mercenaries, specialist mountain climbers, began an ascent that was considered impossible. They climbed the sheer eastern face of the mountain, a wall of rock no one believed a man could scale. Silently, they reached the summit, surprising and killing the sentries at the eastern watchtower. They secured ropes. This was the turning point. With this small foothold secured, the Crusaders began the slow, agonizing process of hauling a trebuchet, a massive stone thrower, up the side of the mountain. Piece by piece, they reassembled it on the ridge. And in March 1244, the trebuchet began to sing. From its new position, it could fire down into the fortress. The walls of the Barbican, never designed to withstand an attack from above, crumbled. The defenses were breached. On March 1st, the defenders signaled for surrender. The negotiations were held. The terms were brutal. The soldiers and civilians would be allowed to leave with a safe conduct. But the perfects, the bons hommes and bonnes femmes, would be given the standard choice: recant or be burned. But then, the Cathars made a strange request. They asked for a truce, a ceasefire of 15 days. The Crusaders, perhaps weary of the 10-month siege, granted it. This truce is one of the strangest and most significant moments in the entire story. The Cathars did not use the time to try and escape. They did not try to rearm. They used the time for two things. First, they held a final mass consolamentum. Over 20 believers, soldiers, civilians, men and women who had not been perfects, chose to receive the sacrament. They willingly, in their final days, took the vows of perfection, knowing it was an immediate death sentence. They chose to join their spiritual leaders in the fire. And second, they used the truce to enact a secret plan. While the Crusader army waited below, believing the war was over, a different kind of operation was underway. The rock was a tomb, but the Crusaders, in their victory, had missed something. In the chaos of those final 2 weeks, something had been set in motion, something that proves, more than any legend, that the Cathars of Montségur were protecting far more than just their own lives. They were protecting a treasure. The 15-day truce granted at Montségur is one of history's great enigmas. Why would a victorious army, after a brutal 10-month siege, simply wait for 2 weeks? The official explanation is that they were waiting for a formal surrender, and perhaps for Easter. But the events that took place during those 2 weeks suggest another, more clandestine purpose. We know of the mass consolamentum, where over 20 men and women chose to become perfects, sealing their own doom. This was an act of supreme spiritual defiance. But it may also have been an act of supreme diversion. Because while the Crusader army watched the fortress, believing its occupants were preparing for death, a desperate mission was underway. On a moonless night, just days before the truce was set to expire, a small group of men were led to the most dangerous, sheer western cliff of the mountain. They were not surrendering, they were escaping. The inquisitorial records themselves, the testimony of survivors, confirm this. At least 2, and possibly 4, Cathar perfects were tied to ropes and lowered by the garrison soldiers down a near vertical rock face. Historians have even identified the 2 key figures, Amiel Eichardt and Poitevin. These men were not saving their own lives. They were on a mission, and they were carrying something. They were carrying the treasure of the Cathars. When the Crusaders finally took the fortress and learned of the escape, they were furious. They had captured the castle, but the prize had vanished. The Inquisition, in its interrogations, obsessed over this escape. What did they take? This is the central mystery that elevates Montségur from a military tragedy to an enduring legend. What was this treasure, so valuable that 220 people would willingly burn to death to buy time for its escape? The theories are as wild as they are profound. Was it material wealth? The Church had long accused the Cathars of hoarding a vast treasure, a war chest, to fund their heresy. It's plausible that gold and silver were lowered down the mountain to fund a future resistance, but this theory collides with the very nature of the Cathar perfects. These were men who had renounced all material possessions. They despised wealth as a creation of the bad god. It seems unthinkable that their final act on earth would be to save a bag of gold. Was it, then, spiritual wealth? This is far more likely. The treasure could have been the sacred texts of the Cathar faith, their Gnostic Gospels, their secret scriptures, the Gospel of Mary, the Book of Two Principles. These texts were the source of their knowledge, the foundation of their entire world. Rescuing these books from the inquisitorial fires, which were systematically destroying all Cathar writings, would have been a sacred duty. In this version, Eckhart and Poitevin were spiritual archivists, saving the Gnosis itself so that it might one day be rediscovered. But there is a third theory, the one that combines all the threads of this story: the reverence for Mary Magdalene, the belief in the Grail, the legend of the daughter of Jesus. This theory states that the treasure was the Holy Grail itself, not a cup, but the proof of the bloodline. Perhaps it was a bundle of documents, genealogical records kept since the 1st century, a lost gospel written by Jesus himself. Or perhaps the treasure was not an it at all. Perhaps it was a who. What if the 220 people at Montségur were dying to protect a child, the living descendant of the sacred lineage, lowered down the cliff to safety, to be spirited away to another refuge? We will never know for certain. The escapees vanished into the labyrinthine caves of the Sabartes region, a network of underground passages that the Cathars knew better than anyone. But what we do know is this: on March 16, 1244, when the truce expired, the 220 perfects walked calmly out of the fortress. They knew their mission was accomplished. The treasure was safe. Their horrifying death was not a surrender. It was a rearguard action. It was the ultimate act of sacrifice, a wall of fire and flesh built to hide the escape of their most holy secret. The Crusaders had won the mountain, but they had lost the Grail, and the Church knew it. The fire at Montségur, as final as it seemed, was not the end. It was simply the beginning of a new, darker phase of the war. The heretics had been scattered, but the heresy and its secret was still out there. The Church needed a new weapon, not an army, but a network of secret police, a bureaucracy of terror. They needed the Inquisition. The flames at Montségur in 1244 were a symbolic end, but they were not the actual end. An open war, a crusade, can conquer territory. It can break armies and capture castles, but it cannot kill an idea. A belief that is hidden in the hearts of the people, whispered in barns, and taught in secret, is immune to the sword. The Church, having won the war, now faced a much more difficult task: winning the peace, or rather enforcing a spiritual occupation. The Cathar faith was now a fugitive faith. The escapees from Montségur and other strongholds had blended back into the populace. The bonds homes were now disguised as shepherds, merchants, or even simple beggars. The Grail, the holy treasure, whatever it was hidden. And the Church, in its cold, calculating brilliance, unleashed a new weapon, a weapon far more efficient and terrifying than any army. It was called the Holy Office of the Inquisition. This was not the later, more famous Spanish Inquisition. This was the medieval Inquisition, established by the Pope specifically for one purpose: to hunt down and eradicate the last vestiges of the Cathar heresy in the Languedoc. It was, in essence, the world's first bureaucratic, ideological secret police. Inquisitors, typically drawn from the highly educated and zealous Dominican order, descended on the region. They operated with absolute authority, answerable only to the Pope. Their methods were systematic, patient, and terrifying. They didn't just look for heretics. They created a machine that forced the entire population to betray itself. Their process was meticulous. They would arrive in a village and announce a time of grace. Anyone who was a heretic could confess, receive a light penance, and be reconciled with the Church. It was a brilliant trap. Those who confessed were then required, as part of their penance, to name every other Cathar or sympathizer they had ever known. This created a web of informants. It turned neighbor against neighbor, child against parent, husband against wife. The entire social fabric of the Languedoc was systematically shredded. Those who refused to confess, or who were named by others, were arrested and interrogated, and the Inquisition had perfected the art of interrogation. They kept meticulous, cross-referenced records, building files on thousands of citizens. An inquisitor could question a peasant in 1310 about a conversation that happened in 1290, and he would have the testimony of 3 other people from that night to check against. When simple questioning failed, there was torture. Legal, systematic, and horrifyingly precise, it was designed not to kill, but to break the will and extract a confession. The penalties were just as systematic. If you confessed and were reconciled, you might be forced to wear 2 large yellow crosses sewn onto the front and back of your clothes for the rest of your life, a walking symbol of your shame. If you were a more serious heretic, your house would be systematically torn down, stone by stone. And if you were a perfect, a bonhomme or bonne femme, or if you relapsed into heresy, there was only one sentence. You were relaxed, a chillingly bureaucratic term to the secular authorities. To be burned alive. For the next 75 years, this final solution was pursued with a relentless, grinding efficiency. The inquisitors, men like Bernard Gui and Jacques Fournier, who would later become Pope Benedict XII, were brilliant, obsessive, and utterly ruthless. They hunted the last perfects from cave to cave. They rooted out secret believers. They burned the last Cathar books, ensuring that almost none of a written Cathar theology would survive. They even dug up the bodies of long-dead heretics and burned their bones. They were erasing the faith from both the present and the past. By the early 1300s, it was over. The last known Cathar perfect, Guillaume Bélibaste, a fugitive and a betrayer, was captured and burned in 1321. The Cathar faith, as a living, breathing religion, was extinguished. The Church had won. It had achieved the impossible. It had killed an idea. The land of the troubadours was silent. The bonshommes were ash. The secret of the bloodline, if it ever existed, was either lost forever or buried so deep it could never be found. The Church had successfully erased the most profound spiritual challenge it had ever known. But you cannot truly kill a story. You cannot burn a legend. The fire of the Inquisition left a void, a scar on the soul of southern France, and into that void the mystery only grew. The secret did not die. It merely went dormant, waiting in the stones, in the folktales, in the very geography of the mountains. It was waiting for a time when the world would be ready to ask the questions again. The fire at Montségur, and the relentless bureaucratic terror of the Inquisition that followed, succeeded. By 1321, the Cathar faith, as a practiced, living religion, was dead. The Church had won. It had achieved the impossible. It had purged an entire idea from the world. Or so it seemed. You can kill people. You can burn their books. You can tear down their castles, but you cannot kill a mystery. In fact, the Church's very success in eradicating the Cathars created the perfect conditions for the legend to become immortal. By burning every Cathar text, the Inquisition destroyed all the answers. But by leaving the questions unanswered, they ensured the mystery would live forever. The Cathars left no written record of their deepest secrets. They left only their silence, their sacrifice, and the haunting, powerful vacuum of their annihilation. And into that vacuum, the legends rushed in. The secret did not die. It merely went dormant, sinking into the very land of the Languedoc. It survived in the folklore of the Pyrenees, in the whispers of local families, in the names of places. It became an echo in the stones. For centuries, the story remained a local mystery, a tale of a defiant people and a brutal war. Then, in the late 19th century, the echo began to grow louder. In the tiny remote village of Rennes-le-Château, not far from Montségur, a local priest named Bérenger Saunière began renovations on his dilapidated village church, a church dedicated, fittingly, to Mary Magdalene. According to the story, Saunière discovered something hidden within a hollow pillar, ancient parchments. What was in those parchments remains a mystery, but what happened next is a matter of record. The poor country priest, suddenly, inexplicably, became astonishingly wealthy. He began spending vast sums of money, renovating his church with bizarre esoteric symbols. And he built a new library, a tower which he named the Tour Magdala, the Tower of the Magdalene. Saunière took his secret to the grave, but his actions relit the fuse of the ancient mystery. What did he find? A map to a lost treasure? Or the records of the Sangreal, the royal bloodline that had been hidden by the Cathars? This single event, whether true or a hoax, opened the floodgates. In the 20th century, the world began to rediscover the Cathars. Books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail took the local legend and exploded it onto the world stage, weaving the Cathars, the bloodline, and the Priory of Sion into a vast conspiracy. Then, novels like The Da Vinci Code took that same theory and embedded it into the DNA of modern pop culture. Today, millions of people who have never formally studied the Albigensian Crusade are familiar with the theory that the Cathars were the guardians of the descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Mainstream historians rightly dismiss these modern theories. There is no hard primary source evidence to prove the daughter of Jesus legend. The Inquisition was far too thorough. The fire did its job. We have no Cathar Gospels. We have no genealogical charts. We have only the testimony of their enemies. But the power of the Cathar story no longer lies in what we can prove. It lies in what we are forced to ask. The fire at Montségur was not the end of a story. It was the birth of a question that has echoed down through 8 centuries, growing louder and louder. Was the church built on a spiritual truth or a political convenience? Was Mary Magdalene an apostle or a prostitute? Was the church's authority divinely given or simply taken? This question is the true treasure of the Cathars. This is the secret that the 4 perfects carried out of Montségur. It is the secret that 220 people died in a wall of fire to protect. They didn't die to protect a child, a document, or a cup. They died to protect the most dangerous idea in human history. The idea that every human soul has the right to question power. The idea that authority is not real. The idea that the only truth that matters is the divine spark found within. The legacy of the Cathars is not a bloodline. It is a rebellion of the spirit. The church burned their bodies, but they could not burn the echo. It remains in the ruins of Montségur, in the whispers of the Languedoc, and in the heart of anyone who dares to look power in the face and ask, "Is your truth the only truth?" The Cathars, their culture, and their church were turned to ash. But their question remains. And now we ask it to you. What part of the Cathars story resonates most with you? Was it the political rebellion, the Gnostic spirituality, or the forbidden legend of the bloodline? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe for more deep dives into hidden history. And thank you for watching.